How do you draw a battle plan to destroy your closest friend? Not an enemy you've fought for generations, not a rival empire across the sea, but your neighbor, the country with whom you share the world's longest, most peaceful border. How do you game out the invasion, the occupation, the subjugation of family? In the quiet, wood-paneled offices of the U.S. Army War College in the late 1920s, this wasn't a philosophical question. It was a direct order. And for one man, a methodical, brilliant, and deeply dutiful Army major, it would become his life's most secret and disturbing work, to write the blueprint for the annihilation of Canada. The man's name was Major Percy L. Jones, and he was not a warmonger. He was a thinker, a scholar in uniform. His world wasn't the mud of the trenches, but the silent, dust-moted archives of the War College. His battles were thought on paper, with topographical maps, logistical tables, and the cold, hard calculus of military theory. To his colleagues, Jones was the consummate professional, precise, unflappable, a man who understood that the true foundation of peace was a rigorous preparation for war. His office likely smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and floor polish. The shelves would be groaning under the weight of military histories, strategic atlases, and technical manuals. This was his sanctuary, a place of order in a world still trembling from the chaos of the Great War. The 1920s were a strange and deceptive decade. On the surface, it was the Jazz Age, a time of fragile peace and giddy prosperity. But beneath that veneer, the old empires were nursing their wounds and new powers were flexing their muscles. The United States, having tasted global influence, was looking at the world with new eyes. It saw not just partners, but potential threats. To prepare for any eventuality, the Joint Army and Navy Board maintained a series of color-coded war plans. These were not fantasies. They were painstakingly detailed strategic documents. War Plan Black was the contingency for a war with Germany. War Plan Orange, a massive island-hopping campaign against Imperial Japan. There was green for Mexico, and even tan for an intervention in Cuba. Each color represented a potential crisis, a potential future that had to be controlled. But there was another color. A color that was rarely spoken of aloud. A color that represented a conflict so monumental it felt like a civilizational betrayal. That color was red. War Plan Red. The operational strategy for a total war against the British Empire. And Great Britain at that time was still the undisputed global superpower. Its navy dominated the seas. Its empire spanned the globe, a network of dominions, colonies, and naval bases that encircled the United States. Canada, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, all were British territories, daggers pointed at the American heartland. In the eyes of American strategists, if a war with Britain ever came, Canada wouldn't be a neutral party. It would be the staging ground, the northern flank, the single greatest threat to the United States. Sometime in 1927, Major Percy Jones received his new assignment. It wouldn't have come with a thunderous declaration, more likely a quiet meeting. A slim manila folder, stamped with the highest classifications, placed gently on his polished desk. The directive was simple, and it was insane. He and a small, hand-picked team were to take the vague concept of War Plan Red and make it real. They were to plot, in meticulous page-by-page detail, the invasion and occupation of the Dominion of Canada. They weren't being asked if it was a good idea. They weren't being asked about the morality of it. They were military officers. Their duty was not to question, but to solve the problem placed in front of them. And Percy Jones, the consummate professional, opened the folder, picked up his pen, and began the work of planning the unthinkable. He had to set aside any personal feelings, any sense of kinship with the neighbor to the north. His country had asked him a question. He would provide the answer. The first thing to understand about War Plan Red is that it was not a defensive plan. It was pure predatory offense. The central assumption was brutal and clear. The United States could not win a long war against the full might of the British Empire and its global navy. The only path to victory was speed, a blitzkrieg, years before the term was even invented. The objective? Seize Canada's critical infrastructure, population centers, and transportation nodes so quickly that Britain would be forced to the negotiating table before its Royal Navy could even cross the Atlantic in force. Major Jones and his team would spend years hunched over maps, their workspace a mosaic of charts showing Canadian rail lines, port capacities, and power grids. Their primary thrust would not be a single dramatic invasion, but a series of coordinated, overwhelming assaults launched simultaneously across the border. The first target, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Halifax was the key. It was the Royal Navy's primary North American base, a vital deep-water port where British troops and supplies would arrive. To let it stand would be to invite a massive counterattack. It had to be neutralized on day one of the war. The plan was for a massive land assault from Maine, supported by a naval blockade. Next, Quebec and the St. Lawrence River Valley. By capturing Montreal and Quebec City, the U.S. would sever eastern Canada from the west, seizing the country's industrial heartland. Then they looked west. The industrial centers of southern Ontario were critical. An entire U.S. Army Corps would sweep across the border from Buffalo and Detroit. Their primary objective, capture Toronto and seize the hydroelectric power stations at Niagara Falls, which powered the entire region. The plan even noted which switches to flip to divert that power to the American grid. Further west, another front, the prairies. Armored columns would storm out of North Dakota, aimed at Winnipeg, the central rail hub that connected all of Canada. Take Winnipeg, and the country was effectively split in two. And on the Pacific coast, a final crucial move. Naval and Army forces from Washington State would launch an amphibious assault to seize Vancouver and Victoria, blockading the British Pacific Fleet and securing vital ports. This wasn't an outline. This was a blueprint. It was horrifically detailed. The planners calculated troop requirements down to the man, supply needs down to the last bullet and can of beans. They identified specific bridges to be seized, specific rail yards to be occupied, specific political leaders to be arrested. As Major Jones worked, the problem became a purely intellectual exercise, a monstrous game of chess where provinces were squares and cities were pieces to be taken. The moral weight of it all must have been crushing. He was a professional, but he was also human. Did he ever look up from his maps late at night and see the faces of the people who lived in these cities he was marking for destruction? Did he wonder what it would feel like to give the order that would burn a path through a peaceful, unsuspecting nation? The plan was sober, it was logical, and that's what made it so terrifying. But as the details sharpened, the plan took on an even darker dimension. The planners wrestled with one specific, heavily fortified target, Halifax. The city was a fortress, protected by coastal batteries and a determined garrison. A conventional assault would be bloody, costly, and most importantly, slow. They needed to take Halifax off the board immediately. And deep within the plan's annexes, under a section on special measures, Major Jones and his team typed out their solution: the one thing revelation. Their official recommendation was a preemptive, massive-scale chemical weapons attack. Poison gas, fired from artillery, dropped from bombers. A rolling, suffocating cloud of chlorine and phosgene, designed not just to kill the defenders, but to terrorize the civilian population into submission, rendering the port completely unusable for the British. This wasn't a suggestion for retaliation. This was a recommendation for a first strike. A war crime deliberately planned as the opening move of a conflict against an ally. It was the cold, unblinking logic of total war, taken to its absolute extreme. The men who wrote this had seen the effects of gas in World War I. They knew exactly what they were recommending: the choking death, the scarred lungs, the permanent terror it inflicted on soldiers and civilians alike. They recommended it anyway, because, according to their calculations, it would work. By 1930, the work was done. War Plan Red was no longer an idea. It was a physical object, a multi-volume document, thousands of pages thick, bound and stamped top secret. It was a perfectly detailed, chillingly rational guide to a war of conquest. Inside its pages was a plan not just for invasion, but for occupation. It detailed how to impose martial law on Canadian cities, how to take over newspapers and radio stations, and how to deal with civilian resistance. It even included plans to seize Canadian and British assets around the world to finance the war. Major Percy Jones had completed his mission. He had stared into the abyss of a hypothetical war and charted its depths with military precision. He and his team had thought the unthinkable and committed it to paper. The final plan was presented to the Secretary of War, Patrick J. Hurley, and the Secretary of the Navy, Charles F. Adams. They reviewed it. They debated its assumptions, and then they approved it. With their signatures, War Plan Red became the official, authorized policy of the United States government. In a reinforced vault, deep in the heart of Washington, D.C., a document now existed that, if executed, would have set the North American continent on fire. A doomsday machine, waiting for a key to be turned. The monster was complete, and it was sleeping. And then, nothing happened. The world turned. History, as it often does, refused to follow the script. The Great Depression swept the globe, gutting military budgets. The fragile peace of the 1920s began to crack, but not between Britain and the United States. The threat wasn't the Union Jack anymore. It was the swastika and the rising sun. President Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933, announcing his Good Neighbor policy. The very idea of an Anglo-American war, once a plausible contingency for military planners, began to seem not just unlikely, but utterly insane. War Plan Red became a relic almost as soon as it was written. The meticulously planned assaults, the lists of targets, the chemical weapons attack on Halifax, all of it gathered dust in its vault. The world had new problems, new enemies. War Plan Black and War Plan Orange were pulled from the shelves. War Plan Red was left to be forgotten. Major Percy Jones was not punished for his work, nor was he celebrated. He was a professional who had done his duty, and his career moved on. He continued to serve, a quiet, competent officer in the vast machinery of the U.S. Army. The man who had charted the destruction of Canada simply faded back into the anonymity from which he came. For 40 years, the plan remained one of the government's most closely guarded secrets. It was a ghost in the archives, a piece of alternate history locked away from public view. Then, in 1974, it was declassified. The reaction, especially in Canada, was one of stunned disbelief. The details were reported, analyzed, and debated. The revelation that the friendly giant to the south had, in living memory, drawn up a detailed blueprint for a hostile takeover was a profound shock to the national psyche. It felt like discovering a dark, hidden secret about a lifelong friend. The legacy of warplanred is complex. It serves as a stark reminder that in the world of high-stakes geopolitics, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. It demonstrates the chilling, amoral logic that underpins national security planning, where even the most unthinkable scenarios must be explored. But perhaps its greatest legacy is as a road not taken. It's a portrait of a world that almost was. A world where the shared history, language, and culture of the United States and Canada were torn apart by a conflict born from fear and imperial rivalry. A world where the cities of Toronto and Montreal became battlefields, and the 49th parallel became a front line. The men who wrote War Plan Red were not evil. They were strategists, doing a job that their country demanded of them. They were preparing for a storm they prayed would never come. Their work remains a silent, powerful testament in the federal archives, a warning about how easily trust can be eroded, and how even the closest of neighbors must sometimes plan for the darkest of days. The plan was never executed. The file was closed. But the fact that it was written at all tells us everything we need to know about the cold, hidden logic of power. The most secret stories are not always about what happened, but about what almost did. This file is now closed, but the archives are vast. To be the first to know when the next dossier is opened, subscribe to Federal Confidential and turn on notifications. In the comments below, let us know which secret story needs to be told next.